Thank you, Stephen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by quickly recapping again. Stephen has given you some of the idea of what the case studies were all about, but I'll recap the main features of them and then touch on some of the what I'll call the common threads that emerged from those, and in fact are reflected in the report. But I'll try to get through that reasonably briefly. But first of all, what and where, with any luck. Yes, indeed. You probably can't read that, but anyway, it's there on the screen. It's also in, sorry, in the report, and it basically sums up the 6 case studies about as succinctly as is possible to do. And for anyone wanting to understand them in more detail, I point to either to the report, Matter of Trust, the summary report, or the reports on the individual case studies, all of which, as Stephen mentioned, are available on the Positive Energy website. A few things are worth noting. One is that this was a project carried out in a very successful collaboration between Positive Energy and the Canada West Foundation. Stephen mentioned it covered communities and energy projects in 6 provinces involving 3 First Nations, some associated with fossil fuels, some with renewable sources, some involved power generation, some were linear, others were local or regional. And finally, it's also worth noting that they were based primarily on qualitative methodologies, but where possible, were made possible by population size and the ability to get a statistically valid sample, some quantitative work, which is also reflected in the report. But let me talk about some of the common threads, and just to note, that with the passage of time, it was interesting going back, and I guess wrote this, must be a couple of years ago now, drawing from the individual reports, and you go back and you say, Joe, I wonder if what I said then really made any sense. But going back and looking at that, and looking at some of the insights, and listening to the panels last night and today, I'm heartened. I think what we concluded there actually probably does make sense. But I note as well that Stephen didn't mention that he was one of the case study authors, as was Louis Simard, who's also on the panel, who may also have some reflections on those common threads. A couple of cautions. Not all of the case studies could be deemed studies of failures. Several of the projects, in fact, got built, and life has moved on one way or the other. And even where the result was no project, important lessons were learned. Maybe more important, I want to underscore that although the comments that follow sound rather negative, lots of times governments and their regulators actually do a pretty good job. So I hope you will keep all this in perspective as we go through this. But very briefly, a few points that came out. More often than not, policy failures played an important role. Governments, in other words, often did not have their act together, and they often did a weak job of communicating, especially with the affected communities. Some of the opinion research that Stephen went through this morning is consistent with this, and it tends to suggest that there is much more work to be done along these lines. More important still were what might be termed process failures. In other words, inadequate engagement with communities at the policy or planning stage, followed by regulatory processes which for various reasons were perceived to come up short in terms of fairness, openness, or comprehensibility, or worse still, sometimes involving governments acting to circumvent the regulatory process. Third point, context matters. As obvious as this sounds, it's a point that does not always inform actions, and what seems important here for policymakers, regulators, and project proponents is that all the various dimensions of context need to be carefully considered and addressed early on in the process, and as often as possible, well before a project arrives at the formal project decision-making stage. And I think that's a point that we've underscored in our critique of Bill C-69 and in other places. If the first thing the community sees is the project on their horizon, you've probably got trouble coming at you. No community is monolithic. The cases inevitably revealed a wide range of attitudes within the community, and it's by no means obvious, even in retrospect, what the community as a whole really wanted, or how much of the controversy was generated by the loudest members of the communities, as opposed to a widespread consensus view. This is a problem that I think is going to bedevil us forever and a day, getting past the noise and getting a sense of what the community in any real consensus sense actually thinks. Interests, particularly economic interests, while important, appeared to play a secondary role relative to values. A couple of people made the point this morning that we needed to focus more on values, and that's certainly underscored by the case studies. But it's important to note that the values in question most often had to do with concerns about local health or environment or community integrity, or with concerns about being treated fairly. Consistently, climate change, while often somewhere in the priority list, was never at the top. And that's one of the challenges that I think we need to be thinking very hard about as we move into trust and transition. I think people may trust the transition if they feel that their interests and their values and their priorities are being attended to. Information matters, but energy literacy is not necessarily the issue. The timing, channels, sources, and the nature and quality of information affected community confidence. High levels of distrust resulted when the process was accompanied by institutional instability, by seeming incoherence between political and regulatory responsibilities, by official reluctance to share information, or when it became clear that the public authorities in question were simply unprepared to deal with the issues. Engagement has to be real and early in the process. Communities react badly when they are surprised. They react worse still when they feel that they are being conned. And finally, planning matters, and it most often needs to be done in a regional context. Planning, of course, brings its own challenges, but when a community first encounters the possibility of a project, as I mentioned earlier, through formal regulatory mechanisms focused on the project itself, as opposed to the broader needs of society and the overall context of the region and the community. And again, a couple of the panelists, I think, made this point earlier on. The community needs to see why it's coming at them. In any event, if the first thing they see is the project without an understanding of how it fits in the larger scheme of things, the project and the regulatory process may well be on the road to great controversy and possible failure. I want to wrap this up with one observation from long personal experience, both as a community planner, where I started my career, and as a practitioner in the field of energy. And although energy has become publicly much more prominent of late, I think it's still fair to say that most local communities, unless energy production is part of the local economy, rarely think about energy. It's just there. When they do think about energy, they care above all that energy systems should meet the needs of the community, delivering safe, reliable, affordable energy services with acceptable impacts in the community. Bigger questions such as the routing of long-distance energy transmission or the building of wind farms or hydro projects are often abstractions, usually of secondary importance, or when they do become salient, something that is inherently viewed with some measure of suspicion. More abstract still are questions about climate change and carbon. I don't think any of this will change. A lot of this has to do with human nature. And if we want to bring communities along in the big challenges for the future, we need to build based in some measure at least on what matters to them and their priorities. All that said, we know that one way or another, local authorities will have a critical role in the future and it will grow. So are we getting the balance right? For a detailed discussion of this, I point you to the paper Stephen referred to, written by our colleague Stuart Fast, entitled Who Decides? Balancing and Bridging Local, Indigenous, and Broader Societal Interests in Canadian Energy Decision-Making, one of the longer titles. In any event, Stuart offers up several interesting ideas in that paper. I do recommend it, good ideas to take us forward, which we have tried to capture, albeit very briefly, in our final report. But I want to conclude with what I believe are the two overarching challenges for policymakers. The role of community authorities is at present badly defined, to say the least, and still too often subject to platitudes, to say the least, that may seem to imply much more authority at the local level than is realistic or is in the larger interests of society. This will often lead to disappointment and frustration, as well as conflict. And remember the earlier point about communities reacting badly when they feel they're being conned. Policymakers, and not just through the courts, I don't think, need to invest in better defining where local authority should begin and end. Public opinion research, as you may have noticed this morning, tends to say that Canadians think that the buck very clearly stops at senior government levels, the federal government in the case of projects of national significance. But how it works in practice will of course vary depending on the particular energy issues in question, as well as municipal law, province by province, and of course the state of Indigenous rights across Canada. Regardless, it can't be left as a platitude that generates expectations that cannot be met, or we will all suffer for it. This question needs some solid analysis and dialogue over the next few years. Second, local communities most often lack the capacity, and you've heard this almost ad nauseum since we started last night, but it still remains true. They lack the capacity, the information, analytical tools, skills, decision-making structures that they will need both to inform their own energy futures, where their roles will no doubt grow in future years, and in contributing knowledgeably and responsibly to larger energy questions. This will include contributing to decisions on projects, some of whose impacts may be local, but whose impacts affect the society as a whole. This will need resources, money, and assistance supplied by senior levels of government. I put these ideas out to the room, to my colleagues on the panel, who no doubt will have many other ideas and insights that will help take us forward. And I turn it back to Stephen.